He had his gun, so he just swung it open.
I start to notice that, the atmosphere feels a little bit weird.
First thing he seen was this 6.5 foot tall, broad shoulder, dark hair. That freaked him out.
We hadn't talked to her about like life and death and what any of that means. She's 3 years old,
So we turned around. Suddenly there's a whole tree falling across the road.
And she was describing to us that, there was a deceased person that she could see visually.
You're listening to Cryptid Clues, where we tackle the ever-expanding history and mystery of monsters and supernatural madness every Monday. You can find us at CryptidClues.ca for more information, or even check out exclusive content and support us at patreon.com/CryptidClues.
Hello everyone, welcome to another episode of Cryptid Clues. I am your host Taylor, and today we are heading back to the famous Scottish Loch, Morar. Not Ness, because there's another underwater cryptid that resides here. And while the Loch Ness Monster Nessie has dominated that spotlight for quite some time, this cryptid has been witnessed for centuries, going back to the late 1800s. However, before we get into that though, a couple of plugs. Our latest episode on the feeds tackles the mysterious Vader-Babian, which is the South African Sasquatch. Before that, we explored haunted movie sets, so be sure to just check out our socials and live feeds for all the latest and greatest episodes available. Now that is all aside, let's get into this. So, while Loch Ness is a large freshwater loch situated in the Scottish Highlands, Loch Morar sits southwest of Loch Ness. It's the fifth largest loch distinguished by surface area in Scotland, sitting at roughly 18.8 kilometers, which is 11.7 miles long. And it's the deepest freshwater body in the British Isles with an incredible depth of 310 meters. That's 1,917 feet. The loch itself sits about 9 meters, 30 feet above sea level. On the western end of this loch, you'll find the village of Morar, which itself lies between Arseg and Malag. The settlements of Bracorina and Bracara are situated along the northern shoreline of the loch. During the late 1790s into the early 1800s, many residents in this area began migrating to Canada, notably Quebec and Ontario. And we're going to touch base on this later on, but it's worth noting that a lot of the areas kind of situated around Loch Morar, it's not really set up for tourists, especially going back to this earlier time period. A lot of it was just not very accessible, and so the people that were residing here were residents and different settlements going around the loch. So just bear that in mind for later on. When the levels of erosion are examined every year, the basin of which the loch sits is estimated to have formed over a period of 67 to 150,000 years of glacial activity. Surrounding the loch is a mixture of natural woodlands, open hillsides, but it's worth noting only around 0.7% of the surface of the loch can be colonized by plant life. And if we were to look at the fish life, we can see that it's limited to Atlantic salmon, brown trout, sea trout, Arctic char, eel, stickleback, and minnow. And you heard that correctly, eels, which can always lead to a case of misidentification. Studies conducted also showed that salmon and sea trout declined dramatically between the 1970s and 1980s. But just to circle back on the eel misidentification notion here, there is a similar equivalent if you look at Lake Erie, and that's one of the Great Lakes in North America. And we have our Bessie, that's our cryptid Loch Ness equivalent. So a lot of people that have seen this, it's often attributed to being sturgeon, because sturgeon are very prolific in Lake Erie and they can grow very, very large. And so it makes me think of this very similar comparison between the two and the misidentification that can be involved with it. Not to discredit anyone, but it just is a thought that I had, and I thought it was very interesting. I digress, however. Getting back to this now, with all that information now covered, let's explore, and if you haven't already guessed it, what the Morag monster is. Residing in the loch, a plethora of eyewitness reports have occurred since the aforementioned date of the 1800s, late 1800s. And by the mid-1900s, many reports were from multiple eyewitnesses. So to start us off on these witness accounts, I'm going to go with the year 1969 with what is regarded as the best encounter with this creature. two men by the names of Duncan MacDonald and William Simpson were on their speedboat in Loch Morar. After speeding across the water's surface, they suddenly hit something to which they deduced was an unknown creature. When they struck it, they realized that this creature basically struck back at the boat, and MacDonald retaliated with one of the boat's oars, started swinging away at it, and Simpson actually opened fire on the creature with his rifle. They noticed that the creature slowly started to recede beneath the surface out of their sight, and they were able to describe the creature as being brown, 25 to 30 feet long, and had exceptionally rough skin. Notably, it had 3 humps that rose 18 inches above the water's surface, about a foot-wide long head, which it held 18 meters out of the water. That is a very significant height. The Loch Ness Investigation Bureau, which was formed in December of 1961, expanded its search to also include Loch Morar in February 1970. Several expeditions were conducted, but yielded no concrete evidence of a large underwater creature residing in Loch Morar. However, recent sightings have still been occurring. Notably, in 2013, the following 2 occurrences actually took place. On August 25th of 2013, Doug Christie, who is a former oil worker from Brecon, claimed to have seen a big black shape, sort of like a submarine, being all black and smooth. Both Doug and his wife, Charlotte, watched it for about 1.5 minutes before it submerged. On July 18th of 2013, Scott Justice of East Kilbride managed to take several photos of Morag with the following account, and I quote, "It was at 1:45 p.m. My wife and I were both sitting at the front of Swordlands Lodge at Lake Morar, having a picnic, having walked that 5 miles or so, and having parked the car at the end of the road at Precora when my wife spotted something in the water near the shore at Mabel Bay. It zigzagged for a couple of minutes near the shoreline before disappearing. It just suddenly seemed to appear. It was too far away, unfortunately, to see it clearly, though. I wish I had taken a better camera or even my binoculars to get a better view. We watched the water for another 20 minutes or so, but didn't see anything else unusually." End quote. Based on these reports thus far, to me at least, it seems this cryptid is very similar to Nessie. Reuben and I did an episode on the Loch Ness Monster a while ago, and while we incorporated the concepts of plesiosaurs, although we have no factual evidence to support that notion of these giant marine reptiles still existing in today's world, taking into account the differences of saltwater and freshwater, I wanted to reiterate that a 2022 study found smaller plesiosaur fossils of a Leptocleididae, I hope I'm saying that right, in what used to be ancient riverbeds, possibly indicating a time when these smaller marine reptiles could indeed survive in fresh water. However, such a study is still under that scientific investigation and research. So, very fascinating, however. Getting back to our occurrences, in the late 80s, witnesses reported the following, and I quote, "A pair of friends were sea kayaking in Loch Morar, heading to Tabert to portage through and paddle back down Loch Nevis and camp the night on an island in Loch Morar. During the night, one got up for a quick pee, and he was standing in the dark when a huge commotion in the water nearby went on for several minutes, then stopped. Suddenly, a large wave of displaced water rushed up the shingle beach, which was evidence of a large object having moved about vigorously. There's nothing to see and no signs of anything in the morning, and there were no boat engines or evidence of other craft." End quote. Now, again, there wasn't an actual visual confirmation, but there was something that was moving around enough to cause a ruckus. And if there's no sounds of boats or anything, you have to really, really wonder. I mean, fish flopping about could make a little bit of a ruckus, but enough to cause a fairly hefty wave of displaced water. It makes you wonder. Our next occurrence takes place in a similar fashion to the MacDonald and Simpson encounter. When I say similar fashion, I mean around the same time place. And I quote, "My family spent a lot of our summer school holidays at Morar Silver Sands. We would travel from West Calder and West Lothian to Morar. I remember in those days this seemed to take forever. We traveled in a Volkswagen Caravanette and a Ford Zephyr. Back in those days, we rented a cottage on the beach from the McKechnie family, and I have great memories of these holidays, and I am the oldest of 6 brothers. My dad was a great fisherman and golfer. He was self-employed, which enabled us to spend 6 weeks in Morar. Dad would go off fishing. Indeed, on one memorable occasion at the river, which flowed into the loch, He spent 1 hour landing a very large salmon whilst being cheered on by a crowd of around 15 folks. Old Sandy McKechnie hired himself out of his boat on Loch Morar to tourist fishermen. My dad also hired his boat without Sandy to fish on the loch. It was on one of these days we spotted the Morag. I can tell you we had no knowledge of Morag before this particular day. In those days, there was no World Wide Web, and as we were young, if my mum and dad had any knowledge of the monster, they never would have shared such scary information with us. And knowing my mum, she would not have allowed my dad to take us out on the loch. Anyway, on this particular day myself, age 14, my sister, age 13, and brothers, age 11 and 9, and my dad set off to fish. Whilst my mum, with my younger siblings, David and Cuillin from Nazareth House set out off for the Malay for the day, we traveled for what seemed like hours to us on this small boat with an outboard motor and 2 oars on the loch. My memories of this journey are very clear. I was intrigued with the scenery and how we were in such a remote and mystical area. I wondered how people got to the few houses I saw at both sides of the loch. I do remember one very large house sitting in the trees to my right on our way out the loch and wondering what type of folks lived there. After what seemed like a long time, we decided to stop at a shingle cove on the left as we traveled down the loch. We had lunch, and Dad and my brothers fished from the side of the loch. I can tell you that my dad on these fishing expeditions lost all sense of time and indeed would walk away from us and forget we even existed. On this particular occasion, my mischievous brother untied the empty boat and quickly I retrieved it, tearing my toenail off on a rock from my good deed. One of the oars fell from the boat and floated off before I could retrieve it. Eventually, my dad returned, and I reckon this was around 5 p.m. I remember while we were on the shingle beach, a fishing boat went past us and we waved to the folks on board. After a while, the same boat passed us on their way back and we waved again. My dad packed up and started off back up the loch to return home. My dad was a very calm and placid man, but on this occasion, he was upset with my brother regarding the one lost oar. 10 minutes or so into the journey, at which point we were in the middle of the loch, and to my recollection, both shores were equidistant. The outboard motor packed in. We as kids were not particularly concerned with this because we were used to this type of event. My dad regularly took us on fishing expeditions to many other lochs, seas, and rivers where outboard motors would pack in and be fixed by him. As we sat patiently while he worked on this motor, I looked to my right and spotted 2 or 3 protrusions from the water, about 2 feet high. I thought these were rocks at first, but I remember having a feeling of unexplained fear. I turned to my sister, who was sitting next to me, and said, "Look over there. What is that?" At which point, my dad said, "Shut up, Patricia," with gritted teeth. This was upsetting to me as my dad was very rarely angry at us kids, and we were taught all our lives never to say shut up to anybody. So this was a golden rule in our house, and my dad had, of course, spotted the same protrusion and kept this to himself. I and my sister stared at the sight in the water in confused wonderment. My brothers at this point were oblivious down to their age and preoccupation with trying to untangle the fishing tackle, which my dad had tasked them with. I said again, "Dad, what is that in the water?" To which he replied again, "Shut up," in an angry voice. This prompted my brothers to look over and join in the debate. The feeling of fear was now with us all. Sometime later, my dad explained to us his mind was not only on trying to fix the motor, but also trying to figure out how he could get us to shore safely away from this unexplained thing in the water. I'm smiling as I write this, but also empathizing with his thoughts. He must have been frantic. He did, however, on the outside, remain calm for our sake. The upshot is he finally got the motor going, and as we started to travel, the mysterious protrusions, which had stayed with us for the duration of time it had taken Dad to fix the motor in the same position, disappeared below the water, leaving a slight swell, which we felt in the boat. We trundled along again for which felt like hours till we reached the jetty where we had started out from. On landing, there was a flurry of activity, and our mum was crying and very agitated. She, of course, was witness to 2 fishermen relaying to a crowd of folks, including reporters, their experience on the loch that same day, some hours before. From my recollection, they had also had an up-close and personal experience with, I presume, the same thing we had witnessed. They, however, said that this thing had hit their boat, they hit it back with an oar and a gunshot. As we landed, there was a boat with folks on board ready to launch to come and look for us. My dad apologized profusely to these folks. He told us kids not to say a word about our sighting, as he explained later he did not want it to be seen that we were jumping on the two fishermen's bandwagon. But also, he did not want people thinking we were nuts. We're an ordinary family with nothing to gain from me telling our story. Between us, we're business folks, professional managers, a social worker. My mom is retired from the police force, and my dad was hardworking, self-employed electrician. And as I said previously, nothing will convince myself and my siblings that Morag does not exist. I hope I've explained the event, and I also hope I've given you a good insight to our fishing day out. End quote. I love this because it is taking place next to what is, in regards to the Morag, a famous encounter. So to have another perspective on that with a similar identification of it, granted, and I mean this with much respect, no disrespect, and no discredit, someone could listen to that initial story and then write up a counter story to indeed piggyback. But I don't think that that is the case here. I like how they address the scenario of, hey, we didn't have the World Wide Web back then. We didn't know what this thing was. And I think that is one very powerful merit in a lot of Sasquatch encounters, because a lot of these people in remote, isolated areas back generations ago did not have access to internet, did not have access to TV, but they see these things. And you could apply this to a variety of cryptids. They see these things. They don't really talk about them. They don't know what they are. They develop local names for them, but they see these things nonetheless. And that is how I feel in this case. And to the father's point and credit, I sympathize just like this lady does, because when you're in that situation, I know I have kids, and you get caught in a moment where you're trying to deal with something, your motor isn't working, and all of a sudden you see something that could pose a threat. It is unidentified. You are uncertain of how this could go. You get very, very apprehensive and frantic in the situation. Staying calm like you did was absolutely brilliant. I hope that I could do the same in such a similar situation if I was ever caught in it. But as a parent, I can very much sympathize. I digress, however. How she closes out the report is very intriguing to me. And I found other claims of folks who saw something, but they chose not to share it, and I don't blame them. The degree of ridicule and such really isn't great, and it's something that I feel, while we're more open to talking about these things in this day and age, there's less making fun and more apprehensive. And I'm not saying everyone needs to believe you, but there's more poking and jabbing and fun that's around these topics than there is really listening and engaging and trying to get a grasp on what the witness is trying to relay. And I think that is still prominent, where people, even though we're in this society today, they don't want to talk about these things. I hope I'm making sense. I know I'm kind of babbling on. And while, again, we know that there aren't really any tourist roads, like I mentioned before, around Loch Morar, this yields that many of the eyewitnesses of the Morag were residents that were familiar with the loch and not visitors or tourists. There's a mutually emphasized sense of fear of divulging any details to the public. If you are a local resident, you don't want that spotlight. Like, this father didn't want to be bandwagoning onto these two men's encounter. He just wanted to just move on with his life, didn't want anyone to think that they were nuts. So, in closing, we will look at Loch Morar's Expedition 76 report by Adrian Shine. I'm not going to go through the whole thing, but I'm going to post a link in the description because it's a really interesting online resource for information sourcing regarding this. In short, the report details the search for organic remains, plants, and fish, as well as eyewitness reports. And we mentioned earlier, both in Loch Ness and Loch Morar having these surveys conducted, observations made here deduce that the creatures are more inclined to surface during hot, calm water. And I quote, "These conditions certainly cause an increase in the numbers of people near the loch and aid in visibility," end quote. As mentioned earlier, some of the first bits regarding this cryptid spread out in the late 1800s. A man named Mike Dash that actually discovered mentions of the Morag in the notes of a Father Alan MacDonald from the year 1896 to 1897. And I quote, "The monster called Morag that is said to live in Loch Morar has many eyewitnesses. I heard the names of several living witnesses given, but I had no opportunity of testing them at first hand. The last time she was seen was when Innes MacDonald died in 1898. The Morag is peculiar to Loch Morar. She's seen in broad daylight and by many persons, including church persons. She appears in a black heap or ball, slowing and deliberately rising in the water and moving along like a boat waterlogged. The Morag is much disliked and is called by many uncomplimentary terms." End quote. I'm curious what you think about this cryptid. Let me know in the comments or send an email at cryptidclues@gmail.com. I may have to revisit the Scottish Highlands in a future episode because it seems like this, again, is not the only other underwater cryptid in this area that has been spotted. It seems like many variety of these lochs all have their own cryptids that are inhabiting them. There's a plethora of other lochs, let me tell you. So that's something that I feel inclined to look at later on. I also find it very interesting, something that I would prescribe to is that theory that whatever these underwater cryptids are, they do have that similar report and look attributes as being those marine reptiles similar to the plesiosaur. But again, that's something that we can't necessarily confirm. We would need to find one and then cross-reference and do a whole bunch of scientific information. But if you ask me if they're all the same thing, I think that they could be very, very similar. If it was just one creature going from loch to loch, well, you'd need a very, very large and intricately connected underground cave tunnel system. Different from my usual underground highway theory, this one would be like, if you ever seen the movie Godzilla, King of the Monsters, they learn that Godzilla uses underground tunnels, basically the hollow earth theory, to access different points. I'm not saying it's necessarily like that, but think on a much smaller scale when you have underground tunnels filled with water that just act as passageways to get from loch to loch. Maybe that is an idea that could be explored later on. I'll have to see if Reuben would want to discuss something like that. But until then, you can find us on all of our social media channels, Twitter, YouTube, and Facebook. CryptidClues.ca is our main website. That's all the time we have for today's episode. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you for tuning in. And remember, take care and stay safe.